After my parents died, I paid the mortgage on our family home by myself. 30 years. And my brother took it away from me. In one day. With a single piece of paper. My name is Maria Garcia. I am 58 years old. All my life, I believed that family was the most important thing. That blood is thicker than water. I was a naive fool. What happens when those you've trusted your whole life turn out to be wolves in sheep's clothing? And how do you find the strength to fight back when you're over 50? Watch my story to the end. You won't remain indifferent. 30 years. 30 years of my life fit onto one crisp cash register receipt. I held it in my hands, my fingers trembling treacherously. Not because of my age, I'm only 58, but because of what it meant. The end. Or the beginning. The air conditioner in the bank hummed deafeningly, freezing the air to a state of icy, sterile indifference. That was exactly how indifferent the cashier looked as she silently accepted my check. The last mortgage payment. For her, it was routine. For me, it was the end. Our house, I whispered to myself as I stepped outside. Now it's completely ours. The Arizona sun hit my face with its blinding, merciless light. I squinted, and in that reddish light, memories floated behind my eyelids. Not bright, festive ones, but the simplest ones. My father, covered in sweat, mixing cement. My mother, serving cold lemonade to everyone. And Louis and I, small, sitting on the edge of the foundation and dangling our feet. This house was not just a building. It was a third parent. A guardian. It held my parents' laughter, their arguments, their love. And my sacrifice. Yes, sacrifice. Because it was me, the eldest daughter, who stayed here after their death. It was me, Nurse Maria Garcia, who took night shifts, denied myself everything so that every penny went toward the mortgage. Luis. Luis was always different. Lighter. More needy. Take care of him, Maria, my mother asked before she died. And I did. As best I could. As best I knew how. I took out my phone. My finger hovered over his name. For some reason, my heart sank with a strange, anxious premonition. I dialed. He didn't answer right away. And when he spoke, his voice seemed distant, somehow, preoccupied.
Sister? Is something wrong?
Louis. I tried to put all my joy, all my euphoria of liberation into my voice. I did it. The last payment. The house is free. The silence on the line was so thick you could touch it. It lasted too long.
That's good, Maria. Very good.
His tone was flat. Tired. Without a single note of the jubilation that filled me. Come over this weekend. Let's celebrate. I almost begged him to share this moment with me.
Yes, yes. I'll definitely come. I have some business to take care of. I need to sign something.
Sign something. Those words sounded casual, spoken in passing. But that same cold lump that had formed in my chest back at the bank suddenly tightened painfully. What business? I asked, surprised at the sharpness in my voice.
Nothing important. Just formalities. To protect us both from unnecessary taxes in the future. You don't want any problems with the government, do you?
He spoke as if he were reading from a piece of paper. Too smoothly. Too correctly. I'll be waiting for you, brother, I said quietly, feeling my joy drain away drop by drop, replaced by an incomprehensible, sticky anxiety.
Yeah. See you on the weekend?
He hung up. Abruptly. Without the usual, take care. I stood on the hot asphalt, phone in hand, staring at the sunspot blurring my vision. He was my brother. Blood from my parents' blood. The only person with whom I shared a common past. Don't make things up, Maria, I said sternly to myself as I got into the car. He's just tired. Everyone has their own worries. But when I started the engine, a quiet, insistent inner voice sounded in the silence of the cabin, a voice I had tried not to listen to all my life. A voice very similar to my father's. "Be careful, daughter," it seemed to say. "Even your own blood can sometimes poison you." I pushed the thought away. Today was a day of joy. I was driving home. Really home. But for some reason, an icy chill ran down my spine, even though it was stuffy and hot in the car. Saturday. I spent the morning in the kitchen kneading dough for a pie. Apple pie, with cinnamon. It was Louis's favorite when he was a child. Each stroke of the rolling pin on the dough was an attempt to drown out that nagging, cold lump in my chest that had settled there after the phone call. "Formalities," I whispered, sprinkling sugar on the apples. "Play it safe." It sounded so reasonable. So grown up. So why did it make me so anxious? They arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. But they weren't the people I was expecting. Luis entered first. His hugs were quick and bony, as if he were hugging furniture rather than his sister. His wife, Ines, smiled too broadly, revealing perfectly even, overly white teeth. Her "Dear Maria" sounded like a line from a bad soap opera. And Miguel. Their son. My nephew. A lawyer. He stood behind them, briefcase in hand, his gaze sweeping across the living room not as if it were his home, but as if he were appraising a piece of real estate. Cold, calculating. Luis spoke, but his eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine.
"Sister, it smells amazing. Just like when we were kids."
We sat down at the table. They ate cake, drank coffee, and showered me with compliments. Too many compliments. Every moment of silence was hastily filled by Ines with some enthusiastic remark about the weather, my tableware, how wonderful I looked. It wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. And I felt like a spectator who didn't understand the plot. Then Miguel pushed his plate aside and placed a leather folder on the table. The sound it made as it fell onto the wood was unexpectedly loud. He spoke, and his voice changed to an even, professional tone, devoid of any warmth.
"Maria. To avoid future legal complications with inheritance taxes, my father and I had to prepare some documents. Refinancing, title simplification. Boring bureaucratic stuff."
He took out a stack of papers covered in small print. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'm not a lawyer, Miguel. I don't understand these terms, Luis.
Of course you don't. That's why we're here. To explain. It's just a formality. Sign it, and all this hassle will be on my shoulders. I'll take care of everything at City Hall myself. You don't want to run around to different offices, do you?
He looked at me with his sad eyes, the same ones he used to look at me with when he was a child and wanted me to give him my toy. And at that moment, I didn't see a 50-year-old man. I saw the same boy my mother told me to look after. Look after him, Maria. And I always did. I always gave in. I always took his burden upon myself. Is this really safe? I asked weakly, feeling my will melt under the pressure of their combined gaze. Miguel parried confidently, pushing the pen toward me.
"Absolutely. It's standard procedure. We're family. We only want the best for you."
The phrase, "only the best," sounded like the final nail in the coffin of my resistance. I felt old, stupid, and tired. Tired of fighting, of doubting, of this eternal responsibility. I took the pen. It was cold and uncomfortable in my fingers. I glanced at the headings: deed of gift, deed of transfer of rights. My heart skipped a beat. Gift? I asked. Miguel cut me off instantly.
"It's a technical term, Auntie. To simplify the ownership structure. You trust your father, don't you?"
Luis looked at me with such silent reproach, as if I were committing treason by asking questions. I lowered my eyes. And signed. The first page. The second. The third. Without reading. I signed where Miguel had marked X. Each stroke was a renunciation of a part of myself, of 30 years of my work, of my father's legacy. But at that moment, it seemed like the easy way out. The path of least resistance. The way to keep peace in the family. When the last sheet was signed, Miguel quickly gathered the documents, as if afraid I would change my mind. Their visit lasted less than an hour.
Don't get up, sister, we're fine. Rest.
And they left. Taking with them the pie, my signatures, and the silence that descended on the house after they left. It was a different kind of silence. Not peaceful, but oppressive. Ominous. I remained sitting at the table, staring at the 2 crumbs of pie on Louis's plate. And that same cold lump in my chest finally crystallized into a hard, unyielding certainty. I had made a terrible mistake. 2 weeks. 14 days of deafening silence. I called Luis 5 times. At first, he didn't answer. Then his number stopped working. Just a dry, automated message: the subscriber is unavailable. It was like a ritual of self-torture. I dialed the number, listened to that icy robot voice, and with each call, another shred of hope died inside me. I tried to convince myself that he was busy. That the paperwork was a complicated process. But one night I woke up from my own scream. I dreamed that I was little and Louis was snatching my most precious doll, the one my father had given me, out of my hands. And he looked at me not with remorse, but with cold triumph. The morning began with rain. Rare for Arizona, and therefore even more melancholy. The raindrops tapped on the roof, as if counting down the time left until something inevitable. The doorbell rang. I flinched, my heart pounding wildly. Louis? Had he come to explain? To apologize? I threw open the door. The mailman stood on the doorstep in a raincoat soaked to the skin. He silently handed me a thick brown envelope. Registered mail. Sign here. I mechanically signed his wet pad. The envelope was heavy, official. There was no return address. Only the logo of some law firm I didn't know. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The paper inside was thick, expensive, cold to the touch. I scanned the text, not understanding the meaning, only catching individual words: notice, property, illegal residence. And then I saw them. 3 words that crossed out my whole life. Notice of eviction. The air stopped flowing into my lungs. I gasped frantically, but couldn't breathe. The room swam, the edges of my vision darkened. I grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. No, I whispered. This can't be. It's a mistake. I forced myself to read it again. Slowly, poring over every legal term. Based on the property rights registered to Luis Garcia. You, Maria Garcia, as a person illegally residing in the specified premises, are ordered to vacate the property within 30 days. Owner, Luis Garcia. Illegally residing person, Maria Garcia. My world turned upside down. The floor disappeared from under my feet. Slowly, as if in slow motion, I sank to the floor in the hallway. The postman's wet clothes, the patter of rain on the roof, it all seemed far away, in another reality. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the document. It was my brother's signature. The one I had seen thousands of times. On greeting cards, on school diaries, on those papers. And then all the pieces fell into place, forming a single, terrifying picture. Their unnatural smiles. Miguel's businesslike tone. Luis's cold hand. And his words, sign it, and I'll take care of everything. Oh, God. He really did take care of everything. Everything about my house. About my life. The letter fell from my hands. I didn't cry. There were no tears. There was only emptiness. A deaf, icy, all-consuming emptiness. I sat on the cold floor of my, no longer my, house and stared at the wall. They didn't just deceive me. They killed my faith. They desecrated the memory of my parents. They didn't just steal the walls and the roof. They stole me. And in that deathly silence, accompanied by the sound of rain, a new feeling was born. It sprouted through the emptiness, cold and sharp as a blade. Not bitterness. Not despair. Rage. I lay on the floor until evening, when the rain stopped and a slanting ray of the setting sun fell into the hallway. It fell right on the eviction notice, and the white sheet turned red like a fresh wound. It was physically painful to get up. Every bone, every joint protested, as if glued to this floor, to this house. I crawled to the kitchen and turned on the light. In the bright electric light, everything looked even more pitiful and miserable. My pitiful, betrayed life. I opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely pour a glass. The water was ice cold, and it brought me back to reality. Sharp, burning. Illegal resident. The words burned inside me like acid. I looked at my hands. The hands of a nurse. For 30 years, they had held scalpels, administered IVs, comforted the dying. They had been strong. And now they were shaking, unable to hold a glass of water. A voice inside, similar to Lewis's, whispered.
Break down. You're old. You're alone. You don't have the strength to fight. Just go away.
I closed my eyes and saw my father's face. Not old and tired, but as it was in my childhood, with a stubborn chin and burning eyes. He looked at me not with pity, but with expectation. What will you do, daughter? He seemed to ask. Will you let them throw you out like a dog? Will you let my labor, my sweat, my dream turn into their bank account? I opened my eyes sharply. No. No, damn it. I won't let them. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, steely determination. If they wanted war, they would get it. But how? I didn't have money for a lawyer. My nurse's salary went to living expenses and that very mortgage, which turned out to be a bubble. I was alone against three, my brother, his cunning wife, and his lawyer son. I remembered how a few months ago, local television had shown a story about some kind of legal clinic for the poor. It was called Right to a Roof. Yes, that's right. The next morning, I put on my best dress, dark blue, woolen. I put on my makeup with special care, as if I were going to see the head doctor. It was my armor. My protection against the pity I could see in the eyes of strangers. The office was located in an old, shabby building in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Inside, it smelled of cheap coffee, dust, and despair. People with dull eyes sat in the hallway, holding notices similar to mine. I was given a questionnaire. The question, address of residence, made me laugh hysterically. I could barely contain myself. My hand trembled as I filled in the blanks. I felt like a beggar. Humiliated. Broken. Finally, I was invited into the office. A young man sat at a desk piled high with folders. Very young. His face was tired but intelligent. The nameplate read, Jacob Reynolds.
Mrs. Garcia? How can I help you?
And I began to speak. At first incoherently, then, as I went on, my voice grew stronger, filling with the very steel that had been born in me the day before. I told him everything. About my father. About the mortgage. About my brother. About those very papers. I showed him the notice. Jake listened without interrupting. His face grew more and more marble-like. When I finished, he sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair.
It's a classic, Mrs. Garcia. Fraud within the family. The dirtiest kind of fraud. They play on your feelings, your trust, your love.
So, is everything lost? I asked, and that pathetic note I hated so much sounded in my voice again. Jake looked at me straight in the eye. His eyes weren't tired, but burning with a cold fire.
No. It will be hellishly difficult to fight. The law is formally on their side. Your signature is on the documents. But if there is even the slightest chance of proving abuse of trust, pressure, we have to try. I'll take your case. We'll fight, Maria. Long and dirty. Are you ready?
For the first time in days, I felt not a spark of hope. I felt solid ground beneath my feet. It wasn't hope. It was an ally. I'm ready, I said, and my voice sounded as if it were 40 years old again. I'm more than ready. Jake said, gather all the evidence. Any old photographs, letters, receipts. Anything that proves your connection to the house and your financial investment. I started in the attic. The air there was thick, like broth cooked from time. It smelled of dust, old wood, and dried herbs that my mother used to hang up for fragrance. The light from the single bulb cast long, dancing shadows in which I could make out the outlines of a past life. I opened an old chest. The first thing I saw was my prom dress. White, with a fluffy skirt. I touched the fabric, and the memory hit me like a shock, my father filming me with his old camera, his embarrassed smile. My girl, he would say. A nurse. The pride of the family. Underneath the dress were photo albums. I leafed through them, tears streaming down my cheeks. Here we are with Louis, still children, building a sand castle. Here is my father standing proudly in front of the newly built walls. Here is my mother watering her roses. And then I found them. A stack of notebooks with cracked leather covers. My father's diaries. I sat down on the floor, leaning against a beam, and opened the first one. The ink had faded, but his firm, confident handwriting was recognizable.
May 3rd, 1975. Bought a plot of land. Everyone says I'm crazy. It's land in the desert. But it's mine. Ours. My children will grow up here.
I read with bated breath. He described every stage. How he dug the foundation. How he carried bricks. How the bank refused to give him a loan time and time again.
August 15th, 1976. Rejected again. They say a person with my background and education has no chance. But they don't know what I'm capable of. This house will be my legacy.
Page after page, I immersed myself in his struggle. And then I found an entry that took my breath away.
March 10th, 1980. Some people came today from a large construction company. They want to buy the land. They say their plans leave no room for small private properties. They offered good money, but I refused. They said, you don't understand who you're dealing with. We can make you sign everything voluntarily. I kicked them out. This house is my fortress, and I will defend it to the end.
I leaned back, stunned. History was repeating itself. Only this time, the attackers were not strangers in suits, but his own son. Louis used the same tactics: pressure, threats, manipulation. Only he did it under the guise of family. I read on, and here's another entry that stabbed me in the heart like a knife.
January 12, 1985. Louis turned 15. Tried to get him to help with the bricklaying. He said, why get my hands dirty? I'm not going to be a builder. I'm going to be the owner. In his eyes, there was no childish laziness, but cold calculation. I was afraid for him. Maria, my girl, she has the heart of this house. And he only sees walls that can be sold.
So, my father saw everything. He knew. And he was afraid. I sat in the dust, hugging the notebooks, and wept. But these were not tears of weakness. They were tears of clarity. I finally understood what I was facing. It wasn't just greed. It was a hereditary disease. A disease of the soul that my father had been unable to cure in his son. I came down from the attic, holding not just old notebooks in my hands. I was holding a weapon. I was holding my father's truth. And his silent blessing for battle. Jake flew into a rage when he read the diaries. But it wasn't hysteria, it was the cold, concentrated anger of a professional who had seen the full depth of the villainy. Carefully turning the yellowed pages, he said,
"This changes everything, Maria. Now it's not just a dispute over property. It's a story about a son betraying his father's legacy using the same methods his father fought against. It's the perfect narrative."
"Narrative?" I asked, not understanding the term.
"A story that will touch people's hearts. Judges are people too, and it will have an effect on the jury. But first, we need to get this story out to the public."
He called the most influential local newspaper. The next day, a journalist came to see us. Not a pompous reporter, but a young woman with intelligent, attentive eyes named Isabel. She drank tea at our kitchen table and listened. Without interrupting. She just listened. I told her everything. Not like in court, with dry facts, but as it was. About the smell of fresh bread from my father's bakery. About how Louis and I hid from the summer heat in the cool living room. About my mother's last glance. And about how the cold words in a legal document had destroyed our whole life. I showed her the diaries. She read excerpts, and her eyes filled with the same fire that burned in me and Jake. Isabel said quietly, closing the last notebook.
"They didn't just take your house away from you. They tried to erase your history. That cannot be forgiven."
The article appeared under a huge headline on the front page: "The House That Father Built, How the Son Betrayed the Legacy to Sell It Piece by Piece." The effect was instantaneous, like an electric shock. My phone, which had been silent for 2 weeks, turned into an annoying, constantly vibrating object. The first to call was Mrs. Rodriguez, our childhood neighbor.
"Maria, my child, I always knew that Luis had bad blood. His father, may he rest in peace, turned over in his grave. We are with you."
Other neighbors called. People I only nodded to when we met. Former patients called. Strangers called. They offered help. Money. Legal contacts. Just words of support. A film crew from a local TV station came to see me. I was nervous looking into the merciless eye of the camera. But then I remembered my father. I remembered how he stood on his plot of land, alone against everyone, and said, "No," and my voice became firm. I showed the cameras my diaries. I read the very passage about the developers. And I said, looking straight into the lens, my brother became the person our father fought against. Only he did it in a more despicable way. He didn't steal the house from a competitor. He stole it from his sister. From the memory of his parents. That same evening, Ines called me. Her voice was distorted with anger. It wasn't a scream, but the hiss of a poisonous snake. She hissed.
"Are you happy? You've brought all our dirty laundry out into the open. Now everyone in town is pointing fingers at us. You destroyed our family."
I didn't yell back. I listened. And in her voice, through the anger, I heard something new: fear. "No, Ines," I said quietly. "You destroyed it when you decided that greed was more important than blood." I hung up the phone. My hands weren't shaking. I walked over to the window and looked out at the moonlit street. People recognized me now. They nodded approvingly. I wasn't just Maria Garcia, the nurse. I was Maria Garcia, the fighter. Jake, watching this, said one single sentence.
"Excellent. Now they're playing by our rules. They're afraid. And when the enemy is afraid, they make mistakes."
For the first time in a long time, I felt more than just relief. I felt the taste of real power. The power of truth. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with hushed voices, creaking doors, and the ringing of my own nerves. I sat next to Jake, clutching my father's well-worn notebook. It was my talisman. My shield. Across the room, they sat. Luis, Ines, and Miguel. They tried to look calm, but Luis couldn't lift his eyes, his shoulders were slumped, and his fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of his jacket. Ines stared ahead with a stony face, but I could see her leg trembling slightly. Only Miguel remained ice-cold, shuffling through his papers. The judge, a woman in her 50s with a stern, intelligent face, entered, and everyone stood up. The ceremony was beginning. My heart was pounding in my throat. Luis's lawyer spoke first. He was brilliant. Cold as a scalpel. He constructed his version of events. I, an elderly, emotionally unstable woman, voluntarily and consciously signed the documents, and now, realizing the financial consequences, I am trying to contest a legal transaction. He called me impractical and sentimental and hinted at age-related changes. Every word he said was a blow, designed to humiliate me, to devalue my pain. I felt myself blushing, a shiver of humiliation running down my spine. My hands clenched into powerless fists under the table. They were trying again to turn me into a pathetic, weak old woman. Then Jake spoke. He rose slowly. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like glass.
Your Honor, this case is not about documents. It's about trust. About the betrayal of that trust. About how love and duty were used as weapons to commit fraud.
He walked over to the witness stand and took the diary from my hands.
May I, Your Honor?
The judge nodded. And Jake began to read. He chose not the most dramatic passages, but the most human ones. About how my father, Manuel Garcia, kneaded clay for bricks, rubbing his hands until they bled. How he dreamed that his children would continue his work. How he was proud of his eldest daughter, who became a nurse, and worried about his son, in whose eyes he saw not childish liveliness, but cold calculation. Jake's voice boomed, even though he didn't raise his tone.
Maria Garcia didn't just live in this house her whole life. She fought for it. 30 years. Every mortgage payment she made was not just a transaction. It was an act of loyalty. To her father's faith. To her mother's memory. And her brother stole it in a single day. He didn't rob his sister. He desecrated his father's legacy.
The courtroom was completely silent. Even Luis's lawyer couldn't find anything to say in response. The judge looked through the documents for a long time. The minutes dragged on like hours. I held my breath, watching every movement of her face. It remained impenetrable. Finally, she put on her glasses and looked around the courtroom. Her voice was clear and authoritative.
The court has determined that there was an abuse of the special relationship of trust between brother and sister. The plaintiff's signature was obtained under pressure, using her emotional dependence and family obligations.
She paused, and in that pause, my whole life was contained.
The transfer of ownership is hereby declared invalid. Ownership of the property located at is restored to Maria Garcia.
At first, I didn't understand. I just looked at Jake. He turned to me, and his tired face broke into such a wide, bright smile that I understood everything.
We won, Maria. The house is yours.
I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I turned and looked at Luis. He sat hunched over, his face buried in his hands. His back, always so straight, now looked broken. Ines whispered something furiously in his ear, but he just shook his head. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel joy. Only immense, all-consuming fatigue and emptiness. I had won the battle. But the war had cost me my brother. Forever. Justice had prevailed. But it didn't smell like victory, it smelled like ashes. I was walking to my house. To my house. Every step along the familiar road echoed in my soul, not with joy, but with a dull, aching awareness. I was walking alone. For 30 years, I had imagined this moment differently, with my brother by my side, with champagne, with laughter. Now there was only silence and the heaviness of a victory that had come at too high a price. And then I saw them. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But no. There were people standing on the lawn in front of my house, on the porch. Mrs. Rodriguez, waving a handkerchief. Mr. Chen from the grocery store. Neighbors, acquaintances, unfamiliar faces. And when I got closer, they applauded. Quietly. Not jubilantly, but with the same aching feeling I had. They understood. They knew the price I had paid. Mrs. Rodriguez said, hugging me. Her wrinkled face was wet with tears.
Home, Marie. You're home.
We didn't celebrate that day. We just sat in the living room, about 20 of us, drinking tea and talking. About life. About children. About loss. And I realized that my story had become part of their stories. My pain resonated in their hearts. Several weeks passed. The noise died down. The letters from journalists stopped. But the silence in the house was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. One morning, while making coffee, I looked at the large, empty living room. The table where we used to gather as a family was covered in dust. And I remembered my father's words from his diary: a home should be a fortress. But a fortress is not a prison. Its walls should protect life, not store dead things. The idea came not as a flash of inspiration, but as the only possible continuation. I called Jake. I want to start a foundation, I said, before he could say a word. To help people who have been victims of family fraud. So that they have someone to turn to. So that they are not alone at such a time. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said,
Maria, that's grandiose and crazy. You don't have the means for that.
I have a house, I replied simply. And a large, empty room. And you have knowledge. We can start small. Free legal consultations. Once a week. Here. On the very first Wednesday, when Jake arrived with a small sign that read, Legal Clinic, an elderly couple knocked on the door. Their story was painfully familiar. Their son had persuaded them to transfer the apartment to him, for convenience in paying the utilities, and then kicked them out onto the street. They cried, holding hands. And Jake, with that same fire in his eyes, began to dictate the first step to them. Isabel, the journalist, came to me with a box of cookies and a notebook.
This is the continuation of the story. I hope you don't mind if I write about it.
I didn't mind. On Fridays, Mrs. Rodriguez began to teach English classes for immigrants here. On Saturdays, a sewing group gathered in the living room. Women mended and altered clothes for families in need. The house was filled with voices. Arguments. Laughter. Life. Once, I was standing in the kitchen, pouring hot chocolate into mugs for the children who were doing their homework at the large table in the living room. I looked at this scene, at Mr. Chen explaining the basics of gardening to someone, at Jake bent over papers with a new client, at the light pouring in from the windows, and my heart was filled with an unfamiliar, warm, and peaceful feeling. I had won. But the main victory was not in court. It was here. In this noise. In this life. I didn't just get my walls back. I found a way to fill them with meaning that was greater than myself. I finally found more than just a home. I found a real family. One that is not bound by blood, but by something stronger, shared pain, shared hope, and a desire to help each other get back up after falling.
If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who might need it. Your support can be someone's ray of hope. And now we want to ask you, have you or your loved ones faced injustice? What helped you find the strength to fight? Share your experience in the comments. Your words can help.